Hello and good morning, everybody. It is I, Lore Seeker, and I was just having a conversation over on Discord, and I felt that the topic of the conversation would make for a good video topic worth talking about and sharing with all of you, and that is the major threats in the Magic the Gathering multiverse, and the fact that we are desperately in need of one. So, let's talk about the current lineup of threats to the multiverse. We have none. I know that kind of sounds silly to say that there are no threats to the multiverse, with New Phyrexia looming on the horizon and the danger they could potentially pose, but I don't think that New Phyrexia is a legitimate threat, nor do I think that they ever could be realistically, and there's two reasons for that. One is the out-of-universe meta reason, and the meta reason is there are 3 upcoming sets dedicated to this March of the Machines Return to New Phyrexia plotline, and one of those is called Aftermath, which tells me that only 2 of these upcoming sets are really going to be dedicated to the conflict itself, which means that the big fight with New Phyrexia is going to be cleared up in only 2 sets. That's not very encouraging, and it doesn't give me a lot of room to think that they're going to be a legitimate issue. The in-universe reason, however, is that there's a lot to go into why I don't think they are a legitimate threat in-universe. You see, narratively, threats in the story should be scaled to the appropriate context. And by that I mean, the power level, the threat level of what the protagonists are dealing with should reflect well the overall setting and the level of the protagonists. For example, okay, for the 4-part Lorwyn, 3-part really, Lorwyn story, Una and for a bit Aisling were the main villains. Una and Aisling as the Destroyer are by no means counted among the most powerful and dangerous entities in Magic's multiverse. They are very dangerous, however, for Lorwyn, and it takes our protagonists quite a lot of effort to deal with those 2 issues. And in the context of the Lorwyn story, that was amazing. Now, Lorwyn is a self-contained story. It has absolutely nothing to do with the rest of Magic's multiverse. So, for a self-contained, relatively low-power story, these self-contained, relatively low-power villains work really well. So when we scale things up to a multiversal scale, and we have groups traveling the multiverse, dealing with grander scale problems, those problems do have to be grander scale. Let's look back to Urza's saga and the Weatherlight saga. Yawgmoth is established very early on as a serious, significant threat. As early as the 2nd novel in this grand saga, Planeswalker, we get a very good taste of what Yawgmoth is capable of and how dangerous his ambitions are, and that threat level is maintained and is consistent throughout the rest of the story. Yawgmoth is this thing, he's this entity, a force that's so great, so powerful that planeswalkers that are on the level of gods are hardly even a blip on his radar. Yawgmoth makes for a interesting and compelling villain, if only because he's fighting against these godlike entities and an entire well-united plane, and he still manages to be above them, both mentally, in terms of what he's capable of scheming, and physically, in terms of just his raw power. So, there are people who have very fond memories of the Weatherlight Saga, in part because of how impactful Yawgmoth is as a villain. Moving forward a bit, there are other major players in the Magic multiverse. The 2 big ones, the 2 big threats, of course, being Nicol Bolas and the Eldrazi, and let's talk about each of these in turn. Nicol Bolas is a character who was portrayed as very powerful and very flawed, very consistently throughout the Gatewatch saga and the preamble leading up to it, ever since like 2008 or so. At the very least, ever since the Agents of Artifice and Alara novels, Nicol Bolas has always been portrayed as this hugely ambitious, very powerful, but also very capable of making mistakes character. And as much as we don't like the novels, they end well and stay consistent with his character. Very powerful, very prone to mistakes. I am personally convinced that if it were not for the unfortunate quality of War of the Sparks overall novel, the Gatewatch saga as a whole would be relatively fondly remembered. Unfortunately, the ending was just such a catastrophe that even WotC appears to be trying to forget like it ever happened. Now, the Eldrazi are another force entirely, and that's exactly what they are. They were a force. They were a part of nature itself, completely destroying and breaking down worlds. And for almost 2 whole blocks, they maintained that significant threat level. Unfortunately, they had 2 things working against them. One is WotC wanted them out of the way because they were a problem without a solution, and 2, Wizards really started wanting to emulate the MCU around this time, so they had them being defeated by the Gatewatch newly formed characters who are really way below their threat level, but defeated they were. Unfortunate. Now we move on to New Phyrexia and the supposed threat level. New Phyrexia isn't like the Eldrazi. They aren't like Nicol Bolas, and they aren't even very much like the original Phyrexia and Yawgmoth. You see, OG Phyrexia was a serious problem. They terrorized and threatened every single world that they interacted with. New Phyrexia, meanwhile, is still apparently struggling to maintain absolute control over one plane, and that's not a good sign for their overall threat level. Moving on, there's the big hitters, the heavy hitters of New Phyrexia, and that is their leaders, the Praetors. We've encountered, in excess of the original introduction, a few times. We've met the Praetors a few times. There was on Kaldheim with Vorinclex, New Capenna with Urabrask, and Sheoldred on Dominaria, and Jin-Gitaxias on Kamigawa. And with the exception of Sheoldred, arguably, most of them were abject failures. And by that I mean not failures in terms of their goals. They accomplished their goals for the most part. I'm speaking strictly, they are failures in terms of establishing themselves as a serious threat. 3 out of the 4 Praetors we encountered so far just weren't all that menacing. Now, I understand Urabrask, it's because he wasn't trying to be menacing and he's trying to be a good guy, but Vorinclex gets bodied. Jin-Gitaxias gets bodied. That's not really good. When Vorinclex, the first Praetor we see, gets one-upped and defeated by guy with stick using basic magic, we're not really seeing him at his best, are we? We're not really being told right out the gate that this is a serious big monster that we have to be worried about. And that extends to the entirety of New Phyrexia. It doesn't help, of course, that out of context, out of the story in meta, we're already kind of know in advance that they are going to lose, and probably hard. But it brings me back to the core of the discussion, which is we need a serious threat, one that is scaled appropriately to the context. Now, after the upcoming March of the Machines, there is 3 sets. There is New Phyrexia, March of the Machines, and March of the Machines Aftermath. Then we return to adventuring across the multiverse, like we were for the last 2 years or so. After that point, we will be completely devoid of any major threats to the multiverse. Nicol Bolas is in Super Timeout Jail, and the Eldrazi are 2 down and 1 in Super Jail as well. And New Phyrexia will be presumably gone. So, if Wizards wants to continue with this big interconnected multiverse story, and they want to continue using the Gatewatch, they're going to have to introduce, and soon, a serious, significant threat to that multiverse and to the Gatewatch. Otherwise, narratively, we're going to have ultimately nothing worth doing. Yes, there is the exploration part of the multiverse, and that I truly do love very much. Do not get me wrong, I would love nothing more than just bouncing around from world to world, learning about the local flora, fauna, their traditions and customs, and all the crazy adventuring that comes with it. But look at, for example, the Strixhaven story, where the Auric threat was ultimately kind of a joke, and that was because by that point, the story surrounding Strixhaven was already scaled up to include things like Nicol Bolas. And it's not Strixhaven's fault that it had such a disappointing villain, it's just that the villain wasn't appropriate for the scale at the time. By that point, Liliana has dealt with Tezzeret, the Eldrazi, and Nicol Bolas. What the hell was that nameless Auric leader going to do to her? It's really funny. If this problem, and it is a problem, the lack of a serious, significant threat appropriate to the story, there are two possible solutions, and I like both of them equally, I assure you. Solution one is to introduce another significant and serious threat, maintain that threat through several interconnected stories, and have it pay off well. They did this before, and I'm confident that they can do it again. Personally, if this happens, I hope that this threat is the unintended consequences that Ugin was kind of hinting at in regards to the defeat of the Eldrazi. Maybe there's some other kind of creature out there that the Eldrazi were keeping in check by devouring worlds, and in order to deal with that problem, first the Gatewatch tries to fight it, they realize they can't, and they have to get Emrakul to come out of timeout to deal with the problem. That's just an example. It's the example that I like personally. Option two is that Wizards scales back the scale of its story. Scales and scales. And by that I mean, get rid of the Gatewatch. Get rid of the interconnected multiverse stories. Stop having every character know every other character, and stop having every single individual who can planeswalk interact with the greater narrative. That's unnecessary, and frankly, it's kind of annoying, but if the story scales down to the individual planes and the events happening on those individual planes, like with the original Kamigawa story, like with Lorwyn, there is the potential for the individual threats in those stories being far more memorable than the problems that occur on a grander scale, just because they're far more memorable and impactful to the narrative of those individual stories. And it makes for a very interesting opportunity because, in theory, after March of the Machines, we'll have the option, the potential for a complete reset and a clean slate. Hopefully, after that, we could have the opportunity to go to several worlds and interact with several problems, not necessarily antagonists, but problems and the solutions to them. And that's really all it is. Magic needs either A, a brand new threat, or B, it needs to tone down its scale quite a bit. And I don't know, I obviously have no idea what Wizards is planning. As I've said before on this channel, my cynicism has won out over and over in terms of the future of the Magic story. And I really do want it to be good, and, this is just one problem that I've noticed as a casual Vorthos that has a very easy solution, multiple easy solutions, in fact, and I hope that, in the end, Wante goes for it. Thank you guys so much for listening for however long this took. I will talk to you later, and I promise there is actual lore content on its way. I'm just kind of burned out thanks to the holiday season and some other stuff I've got going on. Have a great day!